former luxury escort reveals.
Have you ever wondered what the spiritual price of the choices we make is? What happens to a soul that exchanges its essence for the illusion of pleasure and power? Today, you will hear a story that will challenge everything you believe about hell, what happens beyond this life, and the eternal consequences of our actions. Get ready, because what will be revealed could change your outlook forever. Imagine a place where the fire never goes out, where screams echo in an endless void, and where every wrong decision in life becomes a chain that imprisons the soul. This is not just a story of pain, but of shocking revelations from the depths of hell. A place where regret comes too late and where choices made in life seal eternal destinies. Do you believe in hell? Or is it just a myth, a metaphor created to keep us on the right path? For many, hell is a distant idea, something unreal. But to those who have seen him, he is more real than anything human eyes can imagine. And that's what we're going to talk about here. A powerful and real testimony from someone who experienced luxury, seduction, and perdition, but was faced with the spiritual consequences of that path. This report is not about moralism or judgments, but about the spiritual weight of choices. What if Satan's traps were much more sophisticated than we imagine? What if luxury, vanity, and the incessant search for pleasure were, in fact, a bait to imprison the soul? Along this journey, we will explore the hidden price that many pay without realizing it, and what happens when God decides to give one last chance at redemption. Behind the lights, the smiles, and the empty promises, there is a reality that few see. A reality where seemingly harmless choices can open doors to unimaginable torment. Did you know that many people are living their lives as if they are on a spiritual tightrope on the edge of the abyss? This is the time to open your eyes to what lies beyond. Hell is not just fire and pain. It is a place of deep separation, where souls cry out for mercy, but there is no answer. And the most shocking thing? Many of these souls never imagined they would be there. Vanity, pride, and the incessant search for self-satisfaction led them there. That's what we'll talk about: choices, consequences, and a revelation that could save many lives. As you listen to this story, allow yourself to reflect. What is more valuable to you, the momentary pleasures of this life or eternal peace? If this question seems uncomfortable, maybe it's because the answer is closer than you think. But now, I ask you, what would you do if you knew that your decisions today could determine your eternity? Before we continue with this profound story, I want to invite you to reflect and take a powerful action. Leave your prayer request in the comments. Yes, write your name, share your pain, your desire, or that area of your life that needs transformation. Prayer is one of the strongest weapons we have to fight the enemy's traps and connect with God. And here, we believe in the power of intercession. You listen to this story, know that we are in this spiritual battle together. I and our entire community are here to pray for you, for your home, for your life. Prayer is not just words in the wind. It is a direct cry to heaven, a bridge between our hearts and God's. It is through it that we find strength, comfort, and answers to our deepest struggles. So right now, enjoy this moment. Leave your request in the comments and commit to praying for someone too. Let's create a powerful prayer chain, where each name will be raised before God. This is the first step to breaking the chains that often bind us spiritually. If this message has already touched your heart in some way, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is not only to help our work reach more people, but also to ensure that you continue to follow stories and revelations that can profoundly impact your spiritual life. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell. This way, you won't miss the next videos, where we will continue to bring messages that awaken, reveal, and transform. And remember, your prayer can change stories. Shall we pray together? Life before the fatal choice seemed like a dream to many, but for her it was a golden prison. As a former high-end escort, the world she inhabited was enveloped in an aura of glamour, power, and limitless pleasures. It was an existence that, for most people, seemed unattainable, almost magical. She was surrounded by wealth, admired for her beauty, and sought after by the most powerful men. However, behind the sparkling jewels, yacht parties, and trips to idyllic places, there was a tormented soul. She couldn't escape a constant feeling of emptiness, an inner voice that, day after day, whispered that none of it was enough. Her journey didn't start in luxury. She grew up in a simple home marked by financial difficulties and broken relationships. The brilliance and promise of a life without financial limitations drew her like a moth to a flame. At a young age, she found herself immersed in a world where everything had a price, including her soul. At first, she believed she was in control. He made his own choices, dictated his own rules, and never let himself be shaken by criticism. After all, she had everything she wanted, right? But as the years passed, things began to change. What was once exciting began to turn into a kind of emotional obligation. She needed to keep up the facade, needed to keep shining, because the world around her demanded it. She began to realize that those who admired her did not see her as a human being, but as an object of desire, something to be consumed and discarded. This hurt her deeply, but at the same time, she couldn't get out of that cycle. There were always more parties, more money, more empty promises of happiness. With each contract, with each admiring look, she tried to fill the void that grew inside her, but nothing seemed enough. Deep down, she knew something was wrong. Her life was full of excess, but each achievement seemed to only widen the hole she felt in her chest. During her loneliest nights, when she was alone in luxurious hotel rooms, surrounded by riches that didn't make her happy, she wondered how she got there. The void was deep and silent, but also relentless, as if her own soul was trying to warn her of something she couldn't understand. It was in these moments of solitude that the first signs of torment began to appear. She began to have recurring dreams, increasingly strange and disturbing. In some, she saw familiar faces disappearing into shadows. In others, I heard screams, but I couldn't identify where they were coming from. There was also a feeling of being watched, even when she was completely alone. At first, she ignored these signs, attributing them to tiredness and the pressure of the life she led. However, as time passed, these experiences began to intensify, becoming almost impossible to ignore. It was as if something was trying to get his attention. These moments led her to reflect on the direction her life had taken. She remembered her childhood, when she believed in something greater, in a God who loved her and had a purpose for her. But that thought was soon replaced by an inner voice that said, "You've gone too far to go back." That voice terrified her, but she didn't know how to silence it. It was as if every choice she made took her deeper into an abyss from which there was no way out. She began to realize that her quest for luxury and pleasure had become a kind of prison, and the key seemed to be in hands other than her own. Things got worse when she started to feel physically affected by this emptiness. Despite appearing flawless, on the outside, his health began to decline. Insomnia, anxiety attacks, and a constant weight on her chest tormented her daily. Doctors could find no explanation for what she felt, but she knew, deep down, that something bigger was happening. There was something spiritual about her pain, something that made her fear that what she was experiencing was not just the result of her choices on earth, but a preparation for something much worse that awaited her. It was at this point that she began to hear about God again, as if the universe was trying to reach her in unexpected ways. Someone mentioned a biblical passage here. A video about repentance appeared there. It was as if every detail was trying to remind her that there was still hope. But she resisted, convinced that she had already crossed a line that could not be undone. However, that growing emptiness consumed her more every day, and she knew she couldn't continue like this for much longer. With each step, she approached a decisive moment, unaware that she was about to be confronted with something that would change her life and her eternity forever. What she didn't yet know was that the luxury and pleasure she sought so much had a much greater price than she ever imagined. And as you listen to this story, ask yourself, are you sure that the choices you make today are not taking you away from what really matters? Luxury and pleasure were like a sweet poison that, little by little, took over everything. She found herself caught up in a world that promised happiness and freedom, but in reality imprisoned her in ways that even she could not understand. Every party, every expensive dress, every night in a luxurious hotel was an invitation to dive deeper into a spiritual abyss she didn't even realize existed. To anyone looking in from the outside, his life seemed perfect. But inside, she felt something was deeply wrong. It was easy to get carried away. Who wouldn't be attracted to the shine of jewelry that cost more than entire houses? Who wouldn't feel powerful with the constant attention, the compliments, the fascination she provoked? However, behind every seductive smile, there was a growing weight. She began to realize that this world of excess was a real trap. Every decision that seemed harmless was actually a step towards a prison that could not be seen, but was as real as prison walls. What kept her going? The illusion. The promise that perhaps the next event, the next gift, the next contract would finally bring the satisfaction she so desperately sought. But that never happened. There was always an emptiness, a lack of purpose that no designer, bag, or exotic trip could fill, and that was exactly where the trap lay. The world of luxury had an almost magical way of draining her energy, and at the same time, convincing her that the solution lay in the very system that destroyed her. It was like being thirsty in the middle of the ocean, drinking salt water in hopes of quenching her thirst, only to realize that it was slowly killing her. Over time, she began to notice a dark pattern in the people around her. There was an aura of superficiality that connected everything and everyone. People who seemed so confident and powerful on the surface were often as empty as she was. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Every conversation was guided by hidden interests. Even those she considered friends had, at some point, shown their true intentions. It was a world where everything and everyone had a price. And the more you had, the more you were charged. There was also another pattern she couldn't ignore, the spiritual weight of that lifestyle. She began to realize that her choices had consequences that went beyond what was visible. Every time she accepted an invitation, every time she closed her eyes to something she knew was wrong, she felt like a small part of herself was ripped away. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, but it made her increasingly uneasy. It was as if she was accumulating spiritual debts, and the debt collector was getting closer and closer. Sometimes she had the feeling that she was being watched. Not because of the admiring eyes of the men around him, but because of something else. Something that was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was a feeling that accompanied her on lonely nights, when the brightness of the day gave way to an oppressive silence. She tried to ignore these feelings, but they continued to grow, like a shadow she couldn't escape. And then, the signs started to become clearer. She began to have vivid nightmares, where she saw familiar faces being consumed by darkness, where she heard voices calling out to her. It was as if those dreams were trying to tell her something, but she didn't want to hear it. It was easier to pretend nothing was happening, to keep smiling, to keep living the illusion. But deep down, she knew it was real. There was one night, in particular, that changed everything. She was at an extravagant party, surrounded by rich and influential people, and suddenly felt a sense of deep discomfort. It was as if the air had grown heavier, as if something invisible was pressing against his chest. She looked around and realized that behind the smiles and laughter, there was something wrong. People seemed empty, like soulless dolls. For the first time, she felt afraid. Not afraid of losing everything she had achieved, but afraid that she was already lost. That night, she decided to walk away. She left the party and went to the hotel, but the feeling followed her. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized who she was. Everything seemed so far away, as if the woman she saw there was a stranger. It was at that moment that a question appeared in her mind, a question that would not leave her for the next few days. What if I'm on the wrong path? What if this is all a trap? As she struggled with these thoughts, the dreams continued, becoming more and more intense. And deep down, she began to realize that there was something bigger at play. The life she lived was not just a cycle of momentary pleasures. It was a spiritual battlefield. But the enemy was intelligent. He disguised his traps with everything that seemed good, beautiful, and desirable. And she had fallen. And you, who are listening to this story, have you ever stopped to think about the traps that may be hidden in your daily life? Those small decisions that seem harmless, but could be taking you away from something much bigger? Write in the comments if you have ever had this feeling of emptiness, or if you believe that there are spiritual traps in worldly pleasures. Say what you think about it. Perhaps what you have to say here can be the beginning of a transformative reflection for you and others reading. That night, as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she realized that something was about to change. It wasn't just a feeling, but a strange, dark certainty that seemed to grow inside her. It was as if all the choices made up until that moment, all the paths taken, were converging towards a single point. The moment when the truth, the one she had been trying to avoid for years, would finally come to light. She could no longer run away. No matter how many smiles he forged or how many parties he attended, the emptiness was unbearable, and the feeling of falling into an endless abyss seemed more and more real. The nightmares, which previously appeared sporadically, began to happen with frightening frequency. More and more, she found herself trapped in scenarios that seemed to mix the shadows of her current life with something she couldn't explain. In one of these dreams, she walked down a dark corridor, hearing distant laughter and voices calling to her. The walls were covered in mirrors, and each reflection she saw showed something different. A distorted version of herself, faces of people she knew, and, in some cases, figures that weren't human. These visions terrified her. When he woke up, the cold sweat on his skin felt like a reminder that this wasn't just imagination. It was something much deeper. One day, while trying to ignore these signs, she decided to go out to one of the most exclusive parties of the year. Everything seemed planned to be perfect. A luxurious venue, influential guests, the kind of event that fueled the image she needed to sustain. But that night, things didn't go as expected. From the moment she arrived, she felt a strange uneasiness, as if she were being watched. Not by the admiring looks she was already accustomed to, but by something invisible, something that seemed to penetrate her soul. As she walked through the room, she felt the air grow heavier. The conversations around her blended into a constant hum, but she could barely hear what people were saying. It was as if a veil had been placed over her senses, isolating her from everything. She tried to hide it, grabbing a glass of champagne and smiling at passers-by, but nothing seemed normal. The forced smile began to disappear when, suddenly, an unknown woman approached. The woman was unlike anyone else there. His gaze was deep, almost disturbing, and his presence seemed to carry a spiritual weight that made her feel exposed. Without saying a word, the woman handed her a small folded piece of paper and quickly walked away. Confused, she opened the paper and found a single sentence written there. "Do you know where you're going?" Those words hit her like a punch in the gut. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the party, but it was impossible. The question echoed in her mind like a reminder of something she had been trying to hide from herself. It was as if, suddenly, everything had become clear. She was on a path of no return, and the final destination was darker than she could bear. That night, she couldn't stay at the party for long. He left in a hurry, feeling as if the weight of his entire life was crushing his shoulders. Back at the hotel, the silence was even more disturbing. She picked up the paper again, read the sentence once more, and began to cry. It was no ordinary cry of sadness. It was as if all his masks were falling, revealing the naked truth. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to confront what she had become. The following days were marked by a constant feeling of despair. No matter what he did, he couldn't escape the question the woman had written. She began to remember specific moments in her life, small choices that seemed insignificant at the time, but that, together, had built the path that now led her towards the abyss. She remembered the times she ignored the voice of conscience, the broken promises, the lies she told herself. Each memory was like a knife, cutting deeper into his soul. One night, as he was trying to sleep, he had the most vivid dream he had ever experienced. She was in a completely dark place, surrounded by voices that whispered things she couldn't understand. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, but as he tried to get closer, he realized that something was holding it back. She looked down and saw chains attached to her wrists and ankles, as if she were chained to a place she couldn't escape. In the dream, she tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The despair grew until the light disappeared completely, leaving her alone in the darkness. When he woke up, he was shaking, with tears streaming down his face. It was as if that dream had been a warning, a clear message that time was running out. She began to realize that luxury, pleasure, and choices that once seemed harmless were actually the chains that held her back. More than that, he realized that he wasn't just living an empty life. I was heading towards something much worse, something that made emptiness feel like a relief. Now I ask you, have you ever felt like your choices were pulling you towards something you couldn't escape? Have you ever felt trapped, like you're being dragged somewhere you don't want to be? Write in the comments what you think about this. Write the word chains if you have ever felt this spiritual weight. I want to know your story. Your experience may help others who are facing the same dilemma. The night everything changed, she wasn't sleeping. It was something different, something she couldn't explain. Sitting on the bed, the paper with the phrase, "Do you know where you are going?" It still sat on the bedside table, a constant reminder of the weight he now carried. Fatigue dominated her, but it was a tiredness that didn't just come from the body, it came from the soul. She closed her eyes, waiting for sleep to take her, but what happened was so much deeper, so much more real than any dream or nightmare she'd ever had before. Suddenly, she felt like she was being pulled out of her own body. It was as if her soul was being ripped out abruptly, while an icy void enveloped her. Everything around her went dark, a kind of darkness she had never experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something dense, heavy, as if that darkness had a life of its own. Then came the sounds. First, an oppressive silence, followed by a distant echo that seemed to grow louder as she fell. I fell quickly, as if I were being sucked into an infinite tunnel. When she finally stopped, she was no longer alone. The place where he found himself was terrifying. Around him, everything seemed deformed, like a distorted version of reality. She felt an unbearable heat, a fire that didn't burn her skin but reached something deeper, as if it were aimed directly at her soul. Screams echoed from all sides, screams so loud and desperate that they seemed to pierce his mind. It was impossible to identify where they came from or who was emitting them, but she knew they were souls. Tormented souls, trapped in a place from which there was no escape. The ground beneath his feet was made of something that felt like flesh, but that pulsed and gave off a suffocating heat. Each step was accompanied by a feeling of revulsion and dread, as if she were walking in her own sins. In the air, the smell of sulfur was so strong that it seemed to tear your throat with each breath. There was no wind, just a heavy air that left her feeling constantly suffocated. In the distance, she saw shadows moving in shapes that weren't human, but that seemed conscious, as if they were watching her every move. As he tried to understand where he was, a voice echoed in the room, deep and frightening. "Welcome to the place where your choices lead," said the voice. It was as if the words had a weight of their own, penetrating even the deepest corners of your mind. She tried to respond, but her voice wouldn't come out. Fear dominated her, paralyzing every part of her being. There was no way to fight it, no way to escape. Every second in that place felt like an eternity, and the pain I felt wasn't just physical. It was an emotional and spiritual pain, as if all the wrong decisions she had made were being dumped on her all at once. Then, she began to see figures emerging from the shadows. They were silhouettes that looked human, but carried marks and deformities that reflected their sins. A figure approached, and when she looked into that entity's eyes, she felt as if she was looking straight into despair. "You belong here," the figure said, his voice filled with cruel certainty. Those words hit her like a blow. Was it true? Had all the luxury, all the pleasure, and all the vanity she had pursued led her here, to a place where there was no redemption? As she walked, being forced to witness scenes of suffering that went beyond anything she could imagine, she began to realize that every scream, every wail, carried a story. They were people who, like her, had chosen to live only for themselves, ignoring the spiritual consequences. And now, here they were, trapped in an endless cycle of regret and pain. It was a place where there was no mercy, where time seemed to have no end, and where every soul was doomed to relive its mistakes over and over again, with no hope of escape. At one point, she was taken to a cliff. Looking down, she saw an endless abyss, filled with souls writhing and screaming as black flames consumed them. Those flames were not common. They seemed alive, as if they had an intention of their own, an evil pleasure in torturing. It was then that she felt something pulling her closer to the edge. Desperation took over her, and all she could think was that maybe this was her destiny. The voice echoed again, this time even louder. You had choices, but you chose to ignore them. Now, this is your home. However, while all seemed lost, something unexpected happened. A light shone in the distance, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch his attention. The shadows around him retreated for an instant, as if they feared the presence of that light. She felt for a brief moment a mixture of hope and regret. But the light was still far away, and she didn't know how to reach it. At this moment, a different voice appeared, soft and full of authority. You still have a chance, but you need to decide now. And you, who are listening to this story, have you ever thought about the impact of your choices? Have you ever wondered where you are going? Write the word in the comments, choice, because every decision you make is a door that opens for good or evil. I want to know what you think, because reflecting on this could be the beginning of something much bigger in your life. The light was still distant, but its presence brought something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. However, this feeling was quickly crushed by the weight of where he was. Every step he took was like crossing a field of judgment, where his own sins became shackles, trapping his movements and crushing his will. All around her, the screams of tormented souls never ceased, echoing like an incessant reminder of where she was. There was no rest, there was no silence, and most of all, there was no forgiveness in that place. As she walked, still observing the light in the distance, she was confronted by a vision that left her paralyzed. In front of her, as if in a distorted mirror, she saw specific moments from her own life being projected into the air. It was like watching a cruel movie, where choices that seemed so simple and harmless at the time were now exposed as seeds of destruction. She found herself accepting contracts, manipulating people, ignoring warnings, and worst of all, betraying herself. Each act was charged with a new dimension, as if all her actions had left marks that she never noticed while she was alive. One of these projected moments, she saw the first time she made a decision based solely on money. At the time, it seemed banal, a practical choice, with almost no consequences. But now, in this place, she saw how that simple act opened a door that should never have been opened. The doors, however, were treacherous. They didn't seem scary, on the surface. On the contrary, they were decorated with promises of success, pleasure, and freedom. But what was behind them was the beginning of a chain of events that led her there. As she continued watching, she was overcome with a feeling of deep despair. She wanted to scream. She wanted to justify her actions. But no one listened to her. There was no one there to listen, only the shadows that surrounded her, feeding on her anguish. It was at that moment that the familiar voice echoed again, but this time closer, more threatening. Did you think these choices didn't matter? Did you think you could escape the consequences? She fell to her knees, feeling a crushing weight on her back. It was as if every mistake, every decision was being laid upon her at once. But at the same time, something inside her began to awaken, a thought she couldn't ignore. What if there is still a way out? It was a fragile thought, almost imperceptible, but enough to rekindle the will to fight. It was then that the revelations began to come clearly. The first thing she realized was that hell was not just a physical place, but a state of absolute separation from all that is good, pure, and true. She understood that the torments souls suffered were not just external punishments, but a direct manifestation of the choices they made. Every pain, every tear, was a natural consequence of the life they had led. Hell, she realized, was not just a place of fire and darkness. It was a place of confrontation, where no one could escape themselves. She also began to understand how small actions can have big spiritual repercussions. An act of pride, a seemingly harmless lie, a selfish decision. All of it was like planting seeds that grew over time until they became trees she could no longer cut down. It was at that moment that a figure appeared in front of him. It was a shadow, but with shining eyes like burning embers. The figure spoke in a voice that seemed to come from within her. You knew deep down you were wrong, but you chose to ignore it. Those words echoed like a hammer in his mind. She remembered all the times she felt that discomfort in her heart, that feeling that she should do something different, but chose not to listen. How many times did she justify herself? How many times did you tell yourself that you had everything under control, that you could deal with the consequences later? Now, later had come, and she didn't know how to turn it back. At the same time, the revelations weren't just about her. She began to see how her actions affected other people. Every lie he told, every broken promise, every manipulation, it all created ripples that affected those around him. She saw people crying because of her, people who were hurt by her choices. It was like a punch in the gut to realize that hell wasn't just about what she had done to herself, but what she had done to others. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: regret. It wasn't just a feeling of sadness at being caught, but a deep pain for everything she had destroyed. It was as if the chains around her were starting to tighten, but at the same time, she knew that this regret was the only thing that could set her free. Have you ever stopped to think about the seeds you are planting today? Will they blossom into something that you will be proud of, or will they grow into something that traps you? Write the word in the comments, freedom, if you believe it is possible to break these chains. Share what you think, because these reflections could be the first step towards a change you never knew you needed. While everything around her seemed to suffocate her, with the incessant screams, the moving shadows, and the guilt weighing on her, shoulders like an invisible chain, the light in the distance began to shine more brightly. She didn't know where it came from, but something about that luminosity awakened a strength that she barely remembered existed within her. It was a different light, which not only illuminated, but brought with it a feeling of peace and a lightness that contrasted brutally with the environment in which it was located. She tried to get up, but the chains holding her pulled her back. Each attempt felt like a futile effort, as if the shackles were made not just of iron, but of the accumulated weight of his choices and regrets. It was then that the voice echoed again, no longer distant, but close and so real that it seemed to be inside her. You can still choose, but the choice needs to be made now. Those words penetrated his soul like a desperate cry for attention. It was as if something or someone was giving him one last opportunity to break free, but with every second that passed, the light seemed to move away. With effort, she looked around and saw the figures around her moving. The shadows that had previously seemed indifferent were now restless, as if they feared the presence of that light. It was as if that glow had the power to expose what they wanted to hide. And then she realized that the light was not just a distant presence. It was something that was calling to her. She could feel it, like a silent invitation that said, "Come, if you want to be free." But the screams around her began to increase. There were voices that mocked, that laughed, that tried to convince her that it was too late. "Do you really think you can get out of here? You belong here," one of them shouted. This voice was different from the others, carrying a dark authority that made his heart race. But even in the face of fear, the light continued to shine, like a promise that there was something beyond that suffering. She tried once again to move, pulling at the shackles that bound her. Every step was a struggle, and the shadows seemed to grow more agitated with every move I made toward the light. It was as if hell itself was trying to stop him from leaving. But as she struggled, she began to feel something different. It wasn't physical strength, but a determination that came from a deeper place, as if a forgotten part of his soul was awakening. She knew she couldn't stay in that place. I knew that if I gave up now, I would be doomed to stay there forever. I walked, still with difficulty. The light began to grow. The environment around her, once suffocating and oppressive, began to change. The shadows receded, the screams subsided, and she felt, for the first time, a light breeze that seemed to carry with it a sweet, familiar scent. It was as if the light itself was creating a path for her, a safe passage in the midst of that chaos. Then she heard another voice. It wasn't the same cold, cruel voice that had tormented her before. That voice was calm, steady, and carried with a different authority, an authority that brought comfort rather than fear. "I'm here," said the voice. It was simple but so powerful that she felt the tears start to flow. That sentence carried everything she needed to hear. She was not alone, even in that place. As the light enveloped her, she began to notice something strange. The chains that once seemed unbreakable began to weaken. Each step towards the light made them lighter, until finally they broke. The sound of chains breaking echoed like thunder, and suddenly, she felt a freedom she had never experienced. It was as if the entire weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, as if the guilt and fear and despair had been ripped away all. At once, it was then that she saw it. In the center of the light, there was a figure. She couldn't clearly define the features of that being, but there was something unmistakable about its presence. It wasn't just light that came from him, but a love so intense that it seemed to fill every emptiness she felt. "You have been called to something greater," said the figure. "But you need to decide now. The path back won't be easy, but it's the only one that leads to true freedom." These words penetrated his heart like an arrow. She knew there was no other choice. There was no going back to the way it was before, and staying in that place was out of the question. With a trembling voice, she finally managed to speak. "I choose the light. I choose to leave here." As soon as those words left his mouth, the environment around him began to change. The shadows disappeared, the screams stopped, and all that was left was the light, which now completely enveloped her. And you, who are listening to this story, have you ever felt like you were in a place with no way out, but you saw a light that could save you? Write the word in the comments, "I choose," if you believe it is possible to change the direction of your life. Your words may inspire others who are looking for answers. I want to know what you think, because every choice has the power to change everything. When the light completely enveloped her, everything changed. The crushing weight she had felt up until that moment seemed to have disappeared, but at the same time, something new began to emerge within her, a mixture of hope and fear. Hope because I knew I was getting a new chance, something that seemed impossible moments before. Fear because when she looked at herself, she realized how broken she was. The light had revealed everything, every wound, every scar, every mark left by years of wrong choices. It was as if she was naked in the face of the truth, with nothing to hide. But at the same time, feeling a freedom she had never experienced before. When he opened his eyes, he realized he was back in his reality. The hotel room looked the same as before, but everything inside had changed. The silence that was once oppressive now seemed to invite reflection. She couldn't get the words she heard in that divine presence out of her head. "You have been called to something greater." Those words echoed in his mind, like a constant reminder that the time to act was now. But what exactly did something bigger mean? How could she redeem a life so marked by error, selfishness, and vanity? The first few days were a test of strength. Everything around her seemed to scream for her to go back to her old self. The party invitations continued to arrive. The phone calls from people she knew didn't truly care about her were frequent. It was as if the world was trying to suck her back into the abyss she had just escaped from. But now something inside her made her resist. It wasn't easy. Every time she declined an invitation or ignored a message, she felt like she was tearing away a part of herself, the part that was used to seeking validation from external things. She began to realize that the real fight for redemption didn't happen in big dramatic moments, but in small, everyday acts. Deciding not to return to old friendships, cutting ties with environments that reminded her of the past, giving up everything that symbolized the luxury and power that she valued so much. It was painful. With each expensive piece of clothing she sold or donated, she felt like she was leaving behind a part of the identity she had built for years. But at the same time, it was liberating. Each choice was a way of affirming that she no longer belonged to that world, that her life was taking a new direction. However, redemption was not just about what she left behind, but also about what she needed to build. It was at that moment that she started looking for answers. He opened the Bible again, something he hadn't done since childhood. The words she read seemed to speak directly to her, as if they had been written specifically for that moment. Phrases like, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," brought tears to his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she knelt and prayed. It was not a rehearsed prayer, full of beautiful words. It was a heartfelt cry, a conversation of a broken soul with a God she now knew was listening. But prayer, as powerful as it was, did not immediately erase the challenges. Each day, she faced memories of the past that haunted her, faces of people she had hurt, promises she had broken, choices that had harmed not only her but also those around her. It was then that he realized that part of his redemption involved confronting those memories. She began reaching out to the people she had hurt, asking for forgiveness, even when she knew some of them would never forgive her. Each apology was like a brick being removed from a wall that separated her from true freedom. Another big challenge was relearning to see value in herself. For years, she believed that her value was in her appearance, in the money she had, in the power she wielded over others. Now she needed to find a new way of seeing herself, one that wasn't tied to the superficial. It was a slow process, full of ups and downs, but little by little, she began to realize that her value came from something much greater. The fact that she was loved by a God who did not give up on her, even when she herself had given up. Meanwhile, her connection to the light that rescued her began to deepen. Every day felt like an opportunity to rebuild her life, one step at a time. She began helping others by sharing her story with those facing similar challenges. At first, it was difficult to expose her vulnerability, but as she saw the impact her words had, she felt like she was fulfilling the greater purpose that had been placed before her. And you? Have you ever felt like you needed to rebuild your life from scratch? Have you ever faced moments when every choice felt like a battle? Write the word in the comments, fresh start, if you believe that it is possible to transform even the most broken story into something full of purpose. I want to hear your opinion, because your words can inspire someone who is experiencing something similar. As she walked this new path of redemption, her realization of the traps that had imprisoned her in her old life became clearer than ever. What had once seemed to be a succession of personal choices, made without much consideration for spiritual impact, was now seen in a completely different light. She understood that these decisions were not just simple choices, they were doors. That opened passage to forces that she barely understood, but that were always ready to envelop her and drag her away from true freedom. She knew that many remained trapped right where she had been. People who were still blinded by the seductive promises of a life of pleasure, power, and illusory independence. People who believed they were in control, when in fact they were being manipulated by something much bigger, something that took advantage of their vulnerabilities, desires, and ambitions. That was why she decided she could no longer remain silent. If there was one lesson she had learned from everything she had experienced, it was that the most subtle and seemingly harmless choices could have the most devastating consequences. She began to reflect on the patterns she recognized in so many lives around her, including her own, when she was lost. The incessant search for validation on social media, the emotional dependence on toxic relationships, the obsession with status and material goods. All of this, for many, seemed part of a normal life, but in fact, they were the first steps towards an abyss that often only revealed itself too late. She knew that the modern world made everything even more difficult, with constant distractions and messages that encouraged people to seek instant pleasure at any cost. She realized, however, that not everyone was ready to hear this kind of warning. Some still believed they were immune, that their lives would not be affected by these traps. But she knew that pride, vanity, and self-sufficiency were the greatest allies of the forces that kept these people trapped. It was no wonder that, in her darkest moments, she had ignored the little warning signs that appeared in her mind and heart. Signs that now seemed so obvious, but that, at the time, were silenced by his own refusal to accept the truth. That's why she started sharing her story. It wasn't easy to relive the most painful moments of her life, but she knew she needed to warn those who were still in the same place she had been. And the warning was clear. The choices we make today are not just about the present. They shape our future in ways we often cannot understand until it is too late. Every decision that seems harmless, a lie here, a small betrayal there, a search for momentary pleasure, has the power to open doors that lead to much greater spiritual consequences. She also felt she needed to talk about the concept of freedom. How many people believe they are living freely when in fact they are in chains? Trapped by society's standards, the expectations of others, desires that seem impossible to resist. She knew this because for a long time, she herself believed she was in control of her life. But looking back, she realized that she was just following an invisible script, dictated by forces that wanted to keep her away from the light, away from the purpose for which she had been created. The scariest thing for her was realizing how so many people refused to see this truth. They didn't want to hear about hell, about damnation, about consequences. They preferred to believe that they were living on the right path, even when the emptiness in their hearts screamed otherwise. She understood this because she had also ignored these inner voices, pretending that everything was fine while she sank deeper and deeper. Therefore, she wanted to leave a clear message for those still trapped. Don't ignore the signs. If you feel a constant emptiness, if you find yourself reaching for something that never seems enough, that's a sign that something is wrong. Don't fool yourself into believing that this will pass, or that it can be solved with more money, more power, or more distractions. That is exactly the trap. The idea that the next achievement will be the one that finally brings happiness is a dangerous lie, one that keeps so many people running in circles, not realizing that they are becoming further and further away from what really matters. She also knew that many people were afraid to face the truth because they believed it was too late to change. This was one of the biggest mistakes she wanted to combat. While you still have the chance to choose, it's never too late. It's never too late to turn to the light, to recognize mistakes and start building a new story. She was living proof of that. And you? Have you ever felt like you're stuck in something that seems impossible to overcome? Have you ever found yourself trapped in a cycle of choices that seem to have no way out? Write the word in the comments. Book, if you believe it is possible to break these chains and live a life of purpose. Share your story because maybe what you have to say is exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to change. The message echoing in his mind was clear. Every choice we make carries eternal weight. This truth, which had once seemed distant and difficult to accept, was now part of who she was. She understood that life is not simply a succession of disconnected moments. Rather, it is a carefully interwoven plot where each decision shapes destiny, like a stone thrown into water that creates waves far beyond the point of impact. These waves can carry light and hope, or they can drag us into shadows and emptiness. She wanted everyone to understand this, to feel the urgency to look within and ask, where am I going? Because we often live our lives automatically, just reacting to what happens without realizing that each small decision builds the path to a greater destiny. What seemed insignificant, a thought cultivated in silence, a seemingly innocent action, can become the basis of something much deeper, for better or for worse. She knew talking about it was difficult. Many avoid this reflection because facing the mirror of the soul can be frightening. It's easier to blame circumstances, the people around you, or even fate. It's simpler to ignore the signs and continue following the same path, believing that there will always be more time to change. But she knew now that time is not guaranteed. Every day, every moment is an opportunity to make a different decision, to change direction, but these opportunities are not infinite. She remembered how she ignored her own intuition, the little warnings she felt in her heart. I thought I could deal with everything later, that I could make up for mistakes in the future. But what he discovered was that every choice he made without thinking was like taking another step on a rickety bridge that would eventually collapse. Reflecting on all this, she could no longer remain silent. She wanted to implore people to pay attention, to stop for a moment and think about the path they were taking. The questions she asked herself were the same ones she wanted everyone to consider. Am I living in accordance with what really matters? Am I building something that will last? Or am I just going with the flow, seeking temporary satisfactions that disappear as quickly as possible? Appear? These simple but profound questions opened her eyes to the need for change. And she knew that, for many, these questions could be the starting point for radical transformation. She also knew that this transformation didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like turning on a light and suddenly everything became clear. It was a process, a journey of small but decisive steps. And most of the time, the first step was the hardest, admitting that something was wrong. This required humility, something that, for a long time, she avoided. After all, it was difficult to accept that I needed help, that I didn't have all the answers. But in taking that first step, she discovered that humility was the key to true freedom. She often felt like giving up, The temptation to return to what was comfortable, to what was familiar, was constant. But with every moment of doubt, she clung to the promise she heard in the light. You have been called to something greater. Those words became her anchor, a reminder that change was possible, even if the path was difficult. She wanted people to know the same was true for them. No matter how far they've gone, there's always a chance to come back. She also wanted people to know that change didn't just mean leaving behind what was wrong, but also building something new and meaningful. For her, this meant reconnecting with her faith, discovering a greater purpose, and finding joy in simple, true things. It meant being honest with yourself and others, not pretending to be something you weren't, but accepting your vulnerability as part of your strength. Therefore, she appealed to everyone who was still living in the void, who was still letting themselves be carried away by the traps of momentary pleasure and the illusion of control. Don't wait. Don't wait for the right moment, because it never comes. Don't wait to feel ready, because change begins exactly the moment you recognize that you can't continue the way you are. And now, I want to ask these questions to you who are here listening to this story. Where have your choices taken you? Do you feel like you're on the right path? Or is there something inside you that you know needs to change? Write the word in the comments, reflect, if you believe it is time to reevaluate your decisions. Share what you think, because your words could be the spark that turns on the light in someone's life. And remember, it's never too late to start again. The invitation to change is before you, and the choice is yours. If you've made it this far, I want you to know that this moment was not by chance. Every word in this video was made to touch your heart, to bring you deep reflection and, who knows, a transformation in your life. Now, I want to hear from you. Comment below. I felt God's voice in this video, and share how this message spoke to you. How did these words resonate in your soul? What part of what was said sparked something new in you? Your story could be the strength someone else needs to move forward, or even begin their own journey of change. And before I go, I want to invite you to be part of this mission. Subscribe to the channel right now to continue receiving content that speaks to the spirit, that confronts, but also brings hope and direction. Don't forget to leave your like, because each like helps to take this message further, reaching lives that need to hear what God has for them. And last but not least, don't stop here. On the final screen, there is a next video waiting for you, a continuation of this journey we started together. Click to watch and allow this message to continue transforming your life. May God powerfully bless you, your family, and all areas of your life. And remember, He has something incredible in store for you. Just take the first step. See you in the next video.